Imani Graves was 34 years old the morning she signed the divorce papers, and she signed them at a folding table in the living room of a furnished studio apartment that cost her $640 a month, because that was all she had. She had nothing that morning in the way that people have nothing when the math has simply stopped working in their favor. No savings worth naming. A contract job that paid by the project and did not offer benefits. A car with an oil leak she had been monitoring for 3 months. And a joint account that her husband, Preston Graves, had drawn down to $412 in the weeks before he filed. He had, by that time, already moved in with a woman named Deborah Ansong, a financial analyst with a Buckhead condo and the quiet, composed look of a woman who believed she had correctly identified an opportunity and acted on it. Preston had told Imani, on the evening he asked for the divorce, that he needed someone who was going somewhere. He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. He said he had been patient and he needed to be realistic, and that he hoped she understood. He was 37 years old and had a senior director position at an investment firm and believed, with the particular certainty of a man who has never been wrong about anything that cost him significantly, that he had made a rational decision. He had, in fact, made the worst financial decision of his life. He simply would not know it for 7 years. What Preston had never thought to ask, in 6 years of marriage, was what Imani was doing in those long evenings at the kitchen table with her engineering notebooks and her supplier catalogs and the prototype materials she kept in a plastic bin under the bed. He had seen them. He had never asked. 7 years later, those notebooks were the foundation of a materials technology company valued at $308 million. And Preston Graves had just sent her a letter asking to have dinner. What came next was the last conversation they would ever have. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning light in Imani's kitchen in those early years before the divorce had come through a window facing east, and she had arranged her work at the kitchen table to catch it, because she worked before Preston woke, and the light was the only thing the apartment offered freely. She would sit with her coffee still hot and her notebooks open and her hands already moving, sketching cross-sections of material structures with the focused calm of someone who understood that the work was happening whether or not any particular morning felt like progress. She was a materials engineer. She had spent 7 years before the marriage developing high-performance composite materials for industrial applications, the kind of work that produced nothing visible for long stretches and then, in a single quarter, delivered a result that changed the economics of an entire product line. She had worked for a mid-size specialty materials firm until the year before she married Preston, when a restructuring had eliminated her position and left her doing contract consulting from the kitchen table of whatever apartment she could afford, which at the time of the divorce was a 1-bedroom in a complex on the south side of Memphis that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cigarettes, and that she had never once complained about, because complaining was not how she had been raised. Her grandfather, a machinist who had worked for 40 years in a manufacturing plant outside Memphis, had told her once when she was a teenager, watching him true a lathe part with a micrometer, "Imani, the material doesn't care about your schedule. It has its own properties, and it will tell you what it can do when it's ready to tell you. Your job is to keep showing up until it does." He had been talking about steel. She had understood he was also talking about patience, and about work, and about the kind of person you had to be to stay in a room with a problem long enough to know the answer. She had kept showing up. She had met Preston at a professional reception in the 3rd year of her postdoctoral research, a Memphis industry event where he had been representing his firm and she had been attending with a colleague. He had found her work interesting in those early years, or had performed finding it interesting with enough consistency that the performance had been convincing. He had asked her questions and remembered the answers and referred back to them in later conversations, which she had taken as evidence of genuine attention. She understood now that it had been the behavior of a man cataloging information about a woman he was evaluating, not one he was genuinely curious about. But at 30, she had not yet learned to distinguish between those two things in their subtler forms. They had married in the spring. She had continued her consulting work from the kitchen table. Preston had continued his ascent through the investment firm, which was steady and visible and paid very well, and the disparity between their incomes had been, in those years, a source of friction that he had never addressed directly, but that she had felt in the way he spoke about his colleagues and their salaries and the vacations they took. A pressure that did not announce itself, but was present in every room nonetheless. The thing she had kept on the table those mornings was a prototype she had been developing for 3 years before the divorce. A composite fiber structure with thermal and mechanical properties that no commercially available material had yet achieved. The development had stalled twice, and each time she had gone back to the data and started over from the point where the variance had appeared. She had not told Preston how close she was because he had stopped asking, which was its own kind of signal, and because she had learned through long experience that the work did not benefit from being discussed with people who were waiting for it to produce a result. The small notebook she kept the core formulations in had a blue cover and lived in the inside pocket of her work bag. Preston had seen it 100 times. He had never asked what was in it. She had it with her on the morning she signed the papers at the folding table. The discovery, the real one, the one that mattered, did not come through a phone left unlocked or a document found by accident. It came, 7 years after the divorce, through a pattern she recognized because she had built her career on learning to see patterns in material behavior before they became obvious to everyone else. Preston Graves had, since the divorce, maintained a public professional profile consistent with his continued rise at the investment firm. He had married Deborah Onsong in the 2nd year after the divorce, and they lived in a house in Buckhead and attended the kinds of events that successful Atlanta professionals attended. He had not contacted Imani in the 7 years since the papers were signed. Not once. Not a note, not a message through mutual acquaintances, nothing. Until the letter. The letter arrived at her company's registered address, which was not a secret but was also not her home address, which meant he had looked for it. It was written on his personal stationery and addressed to her by her full name. It said that he had been following the growth of her company with admiration, that he believed they had both grown significantly as people, and that he would value the opportunity to reconnect over dinner at her convenience. She read it once. She set it on her desk beside the blue notebook, which she still kept, though its contents had long since been transferred to secured servers, and the formulations had been licensed to 3 manufacturing partners and protected by 14 issued patents. Her face remained perfectly calm. She picked up her phone and called Patricia Wynn. Patricia had been her corporate attorney since the company's 2nd year. A sharp, composed woman in her early 60s who had grown up in Memphis and practiced law in Atlanta for 30 years, and who had the particular quality of never being surprised by anything a client brought through her door. When Imani read her the letter, Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's done research. He knows the valuation." Imani said, "I know." Patricia said, "Do you want me to draft a response declining the meeting?" Imani said, "Not yet. I want to know what he's actually asking for." She did not mean dinner. She had not meant dinner for one moment. She spent the following 2 days doing what she had always done when a variable behaved in a way that required understanding. She gathered data before she acted. She requested a full background review from the firm that handled her company's due diligence work, specifically focused on Preston Graves' current financial position. The report came back in 48 hours, and it confirmed what the letter had suggested between its carefully chosen lines. Preston Graves had separated from his investment firm 8 months earlier, under circumstances the report described as a performance-related restructuring. His personal investment portfolio had sustained significant losses in the previous 2 years tied to a commercial real estate venture that had not delivered the returns his firm had projected. The Buckhead house was mortgaged against its full value. Deborah Onsong Graves worked as a financial analyst, but her salary, while comfortable, did not support the household's current debt service at the level it had been maintained. He had not written that letter because he missed her. He had written it because a man who had left a woman with $412 in a joint account had watched that woman build a $308 million company and had decided that the most rational thing to do was to reintroduce himself. She built the timeline on her office whiteboard, the way she had always built timelines, in the precise sequence that events had actually occurred, with dates and documented facts, not feelings. At the top, she wrote the date of the divorce. At the bottom, she wrote the date of the letter. In between was 7 years of work that she had done alone, without his participation, without his support, and in the specific absence of his belief. She noted it all without anger. Anger was a feeling that required ongoing attention directed at a person who had forfeited the right to that attention. She had not given Preston Graves her attention in 7 years, and she was not prepared to start now. She opened a folder and named it. With the precision she applied to everything, Graves. P. Final. She made 2 calls. The first was to Patricia. The second was to her uncle Bernard, who had been her father's older brother, and who had been, since her grandfather's death, the person she called when she needed to hear a voice that had known her long enough to be trusted completely. Bernard was 68 and still ran the small machine shop in Memphis that had been in the family since the 1970s, and he answered the phone on the second ring the way he always did, with his name, because he had never seen the need for any other greeting. She told him about the letter. She told him what the background report had found. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "A man who leaves a woman because she has nothing and comes back because she has everything is not telling you anything new about himself. He's confirming what he showed you the first time." She said, "I know." He said, "Your grandfather used to say the material tells you its properties the first time, if you're paying attention. Most people aren't paying attention." A pause. "You always were." She thanked him. She sat for a long moment after the call in the quiet of her office, which occupied the top floor of a building she had purchased in the 3rd year of the company's operation and which had a wall of east-facing windows that let the morning light in at the angle she had specifically chosen when she signed the lease. The blue notebook was on the corner of her desk. The same one. She had kept it for the same reason she had kept everything that mattered. Because she was an engineer, and engineers kept the records that proved what they had built was real. Preparation is not a moment. It is a practice. It was always a practice. She met Preston for dinner, not because she owed him the meeting, but because she had decided that the most complete version of this conversation required his presence, and because she had things to say that she wanted said in person, with witnesses nearby, in a room of her own choosing. She chose a restaurant in Midtown Atlanta, where she had been a regular for 4 years and where the owner, a woman named Cecile, who had grown up in Memphis and who had moved to Atlanta in the same year Imani had, greeted her at the door with the ease of long familiarity and showed her to the corner table Imani had requested. The table had a clear sightline to the door. Patricia was at a table near the back of the room, with a colleague, ostensibly at dinner. She had arranged this quietly and without explanation, and Imani had found it, as she found most of Patricia's instincts, entirely sound. Preston arrived 7 minutes late, which was new. The Preston she had been married to was never late. The Preston who arrived at that restaurant was wearing a suit that was slightly less current than the ones she remembered, and he had the groomed, composed look of a man who had prepared carefully for an appearance. He kissed her cheek at the table, which she had not expected and did not comment on, and sat across from her and said she looked wonderful, which she registered and set aside. He ordered a drink. He made the kind of small talk that is designed to establish warmth before the actual subject arrives. He asked about the company with the specific interest of someone who had been reading about it rather than living adjacent to it, which he had been, and which she noted. When the drinks arrived, he set his down and said, with the careful timing of a man who had decided this was the moment, "Imani, I've done a lot of thinking over the years. About what I lost. About what I walked away from. I think I made a serious mistake, and I think I owe you the honesty of saying so directly." She waited. He said, "I don't expect anything. I just thought, if there was any chance, after everything, that we could find our way back to something," she said. "Preston," he stopped. She placed Patricia's folder on the table. Inside it were 3 documents. The first was the background report, the financial position summary, the debt service figures, the separation from the firm. The second was a timeline she had prepared herself, 7 years of company milestones, funding rounds, patent issuances, the licensing agreements, the valuation history. Starting from the day after the divorce, and ending with the most recent quarterly figure. The third document was a single page. It contained the balance of the joint account on the day she had signed the papers at the folding table. $412. Below that figure, in the same typeface, was the current company valuation. $308 million. She did not say anything while he read. She lifted her glass and waited with the patience of a woman who had spent 7 years in a room with a problem and had never once left before the answer arrived. He set the last page down. His expression had moved, over the course of the reading, from the careful warmth he had brought to the table to something much quieter and much less composed. The expression of a man who had walked into a room believing he understood its dimensions and found himself unable to locate the walls. He said, "Imani, I." She said, "You left because I had nothing. You've come back because I have something." She folded her hands on the table. "I want you to understand that those are the only 2 facts that matter to me in this conversation. Everything else is a story built around them." He was quiet. She said, "I don't have anything against you, Preston. I'm not angry. I haven't been angry in years. Because bitterness requires ongoing investment in people who no longer deserve it. And you stopped deserving that investment the day I signed those papers." She picked up her bag from the chair beside her. "I came tonight because I wanted you to understand, clearly and in person, that what you walked away from 7 years ago is not available. It was never going to be available again. Not because of the money. Because of what the money represents, which is 7 years of work done entirely without you." She stood. She said, "I hope things improve for you. I mean that." She did not wait for his response. She walked to the back of the restaurant where Patricia and her colleague were finishing their meal, said goodnight, and then walked out through the front door and into an Atlanta evening that was warm and clear, and asked nothing of her that she had not already decided to give. She drove home. 2 years later, Imani sat on the back porch of a house she had purchased in the 5th year of the company's operation. A craftsman on the east side of Atlanta with a wide yard that she had planted herself over the course of 2 summers, beginning with raised beds of herbs and expanding to a kitchen garden that ran the length of the south fence. The tomatoes were at their peak in late August, heavy on the vines, splitting at the seams with their own weight, and she had been out to the garden twice already that morning to check on them with the quiet satisfaction of someone tending something they had started from seed. The company had, in the 2 years since the dinner with Preston, completed its Series C funding round, signed a manufacturing agreement with a European industrial partner, and expanded its patent portfolio to 19 issued patents across 3 countries. The most recent independent valuation had placed the company at $440 million. She noted this the way she noted everything material, accurately and without excess, as a measurement of where the work had arrived. She had heard through a former colleague who remained in Atlanta's investment community that Preston Graves had left the city in the spring. The Buckhead house had sold. Deborah Unsong Graves had, by the same account, accepted a position with a firm in Houston, and it was unclear whether Preston had accompanied her or whether that chapter had also closed. Imani registered this information the way she registered any data point that no longer had an active role in her work: noted, filed, released. Andre Pemberton was a materials scientist she had met at an industry conference in the 3rd year of the company's operation. A man who had spent 15 years in research and who understood, with the particular depth of someone who had done the same kind of patient, invisible work, exactly what she had built and what it had cost her to build it. He had asked her to dinner with a precision that she had found immediately legible, in the way that one engineer finds another engineer's specifications legible, and the dinner had led to others, and the others had led to something that neither of them had been in a hurry about, which was how she preferred most things of consequence to develop. He was inside making coffee. She could hear the particular unhurried sounds of a person who was comfortable in a kitchen they had begun to know well, and she let the sounds settle into the morning the way the light settled into the garden, without rush, without announcement. Her grandfather's micrometer was on the windowsill of her study, kept not as a relic, but as a working instrument, because she still used it when she needed to think. She had borrowed it from the machine shop 30 years ago, and her uncle Bernard had told her to keep it. It was the most accurate thing she owned for its purpose. She sat on the porch and watched the tomatoes hold the early light, and thought about what her grandfather had said about the material and its own properties, and the job of showing up until it was ready to tell you what it could do. She had shown up. Every morning, for 7 years, at a kitchen table in a studio apartment, and a 1-bedroom, and a company office and this house, she had shown up. She had not waited for permission, and she had not waited for someone to believe in the work, and she had not spent her patience on a man who had failed to understand what he was looking at. The material had told her what it could do. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. She had built everything worth keeping. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.